Thanks, Jeff. Thank everybody. It's a pleasure, it's a privilege to be here. I love this place. I love the people who run it. It's always a wonderful experience to take part in the Science Matters programs. And to moderate, again, not only is it great fun for me, but I get to wear my space shuttle tie, which they won't let me wear on television. I also appreciate the fact this is not a U.S. government installation, or else we wouldn't be sitting here today. This is it's a fascinating topic, and as Jeff, I think, mentioned, we're just scratching the surface. There are plenty of people in this audience, a few of us on the dais, who remember the analog days. In my business, at Lester Holt Nightly Newscast, they always try to tease to the next story because they want you to watch the whole newscast. Because if you watch for more than 8 minutes every 15 minutes, we get the click from Nielsen, so we register you as having watched, which is why in a 2.5-hour newscast that we do every night from 4 to 6:30, we're always teasing to keep you watching. But at some point, the newscast ends, and we don't have a graphic, not yet, that pops up that says, the next newscast will start in 15 seconds. Which you see on Netflix and YouTube, and it's all part of the digital environment that we're in. And I think the issues here are going to become more complex before they ever get more simplified. So I'm going to explain very quickly. We're going to have a presentation from one of the panelists at the beginning for about 10 to 15 minutes to give us an overview. Each of the panelists will then give us about 2 or 3 minutes as to their research, either from here or at the podium. We're going to have a conversation, and then the best questions will come from you. So we will have a microphone out there. So save up your questions, because we won't get to all of them. And hopefully we're going to, spade some ground here and do a fairly significant deep into this very interesting and topical, I don't know if controversy is the word, but it's certainly an issue. Now I'm going to introduce the panelists. Each one has a very long Vita sheet. I'm going to truncate them so we can get to it. Just keep in mind they're all very smart. That's fundamental. Dr. Timothy Fong, to my left here, is professor of psychiatry at the Semler Institute of Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA. He's the director of the UCLA Addiction Psychiatry Fellowship. Currently, he's the co-director of the UCLA Gambling Studies Program, which examines the underlying causes and clinical characteristics of gambling disorders and develops effective evidence-based treatment and their strategies. To his left, Dr. Kavari Subramanian is from Cal State University, Los Angeles, the chair of the Department of Child and Family Studies at CSULA, the associate director of the Children's Digital Media Center. She's a nationally recognized expert in the role of interactive media in the lives of children and families, with a focus on the cognitive and social implications of interactive media use. Boy, is that an interesting topic. Julie Albright, you may recognize her. She's been on our network a lot. She's been on the Today Show a lot. She's teaches here at the University of Southern California, a lecturer at the USC in Applied Psychology, teaching courses on the psychology of interactive technologies. She's also teaches in the engineering school, teaching sustainable infrastructure courses. As a digital sociologist, she's worked at the intersection of behavior and technology, which is pretty much at the root of this conversation today. She's also the former managing director of the USC Energy Institute. She was one of the 4 principal investigators on the $121 million smart grid demonstration project funded by the Department of Energy, which is also closed today. I had to point that out. And Mariantina Gotsis is with, and we're delighted to have her as well. She's the co-founder and director of the Creative Media and Behavioral Health Center here at the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts, where she's an associate professor of research in interactive media and games. She has a background in arts, design, engineering, with a special interest in interactive entertainment applications for health, happiness, and rehabilitation. Oh boy, don't we all want that. The center designs, develops, and evaluates entertainment applications at the intersection of behavioral sciences, medicine, and public health. So we're going to first start off with Dr. Timothy Fong.
Thank you, Conan, and thank you guys for coming out on a beautiful Saturday here in Los Angeles. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I love talking to this kind of audience. You guys have many, many more questions than a lot of times our scientific audience has. So with that, I'm going to do a brief overview on this concept of digital addiction. I'm an addiction psychiatrist. That means my job is to help men and women and families deal with the side effects of addictive disorders. As a show of hands here, how many here in this room over the last 12 months have said, I may have an unhealthy relationship with my phone, my computer, or an electronic screen? Okay, anyone want to admit that? So those are the questions that we're going to bring up here today. Can that relationship with electronics and digital screen be as toxic as what we currently have and know about other clear addictions, alcohol, tobacco, cocaine, amphetamines, and opiates? Well, I'm going to present first from what my view as an addiction psychiatrist. So we use this term all the time. I'm addicted to The Crown. I'm addicted to Call of the Midwife. These are the things my wife likes. George Bush said what? Saddam Hussein is addicted to weapons of mass destruction. What does that mean? In the late 90s, we came up with this term with scientific proof. What is addiction? Addiction is a chronic relapsing brain disease characterized by ongoing participation in an activity despite harmful consequences. Like heart disease, like lung disease, that means there are changes in the brain that we can measure and detect. That means this is a medical psychiatric condition. This is not an issue of willpower. It's not an issue of loss of control. It is a disease. Now the question there is, how did that changes in structure and function happen? Some of it's genetic, some of it's what you're exposed to, some of it is how you're raised, some of it what happens to you in life. But the way I think of it very simply is this. This is an unhealthy brain. When you have an unhealthy heart, you have heart disease, chest pain, shortness of breath, you can't breathe properly. When you have an unhealthy brain caused by drugs or caused by genetics, you're going to have the symptoms of addiction, which are going to be the things like urges and craving, inability to stop, inability to withdraw your own behavior, tolerance, withdrawal, the classic signs of addiction. Oftentimes patients come to my office and say, Doc, how do I know I'm addicted to something? I'll say very, very simply, if your relationship and activity of that behavior causes you harm and suffering, it may be an addiction. And that's part of the thing about digital addiction and technology. These are things that are supposed to make our lives better, bring us more joy, more connection, reduce human suffering. And those are the questions that we're going to leave for you today, is that, do these digital devices do that? Can they do that? How to do that? How do we minimize the suffering? These are all the classic substances that we have out there that we know. And one of the things that's fascinating about this topic, it's much harder to grasp, it's much more abstract. We can understand, drink alcohol, inject heroin into your veins, snort cocaine in through your nose, changes the functioning and structure of your brain, causing brain changes that lead you to develop this disease of addiction. Very easy to grasp. When it comes to gambling, when it comes to other things like that, we're starting to say, well, wait a minute, how is it that by pulling on that slot machine that you get the same brain changes that you do when you snort heroin or snort cocaine? Scientists tell us that we now know that that happens. When you're doing the activity of gambling, you will see those changes in the brain that ultimately will lead to the expression of this disease of addiction. So that's how we accept it. Up there on the left, we know that behavioral addictions, or in other words, activities that do not involve a substance that are ingested. These are the things we know scientifically are for real. We know that gambling addiction exists. We're pretty sure that internet gaming disorders or video game disorders is an actual psychiatric disorder. And then there are these other ones: sexuality, sex addiction, shopping addiction, stealing addiction. And then there's the speculative stuff, the stuff that you see, no offense, on the local news pieces: tanning addiction, love addiction, right? Digital addiction, exercise addiction. In other words, science doesn't know yet for certainty, do these, quote, addictions carry the exact same changes in the brain that substance addiction does. So, when we first saw this topic, we're like, well, what do you want us to talk about? What is digital addiction? Now, it's also known through other names, of course: technology addiction, screen addiction, electronics addiction. But what does it really mean? So this is the term that I've been using with our patients: ongoing use of digital technology despite harmful consequence. And the subtypes inside that could be things like excessive use of social media, consumption of media, watching videos, reading news aggregators. It could be things like communication, texting, emailing, Snapchatting, with others, gambling or gaming. So one of the things that really came up to this thing that I really want to emphasize, as I've been thinking about this over the last week or so, is that what is the thing that inside, quote, digital addictions that people are, quote, addicted to? Is it the internet itself, the fast, high-speed cables? Or is it the content that they're drawn to? So when you think about opioid use disorder, opiate addiction, are they addicted to the syringe, or are they addicted to the substances inside the syringe? Is it likely that the internet is just the syringe for all those other things that impact us, that make us want stuff, information, content, things like that? A lot of interesting questions. So the one thing that we do recognize as a formal diagnosis is internet gaming disorder. Who can tell me the name of this game? And I want someone over the age of 30 to tell me, because I know everyone under 30 knows this game. Anyone over 30 can tell the name of this game? David.
Mario Brothers.
How about our young folks? Our young person right here. It is League of Legends. I rest my case. I rest my case. So, and that's the whole point, is that on internet gaming, this is not Pong. This is not the games that I grew up with. These are very complex cultural games online with no end. And so now we've seen through the years now, we now have a diagnostic criteria, essentially continuing to play these games, often with other, leading to clinically significant impairment or distress. In other words, your life is worse off from playing these games than your life is being better. And inside those, again, those signs and symptoms, inability to stop thinking about it, lying, can't control, loss of interest. So I had a patient who came into my office 2 weeks ago, and his mother described the experience of their son playing about 7 to 8 hours per day. No exercise, no friends, overweight, arguments with family, fighting with the parents over the computer. Does that sound like fun to you? Does that sound like something normative? No. So clearly, whatever we call that, whether we call that an addiction or something else, it's not healthy. It's suffering, it's distress, and we need to get in front of it, and we need to figure out a way to prevent that sort of scenario from happening. So very simply, what do we know? We know that digital addictions as a term is not officially recognized yet in our diagnostic textbooks. We recognize internet gaming disorder, we recognize gambling disorder, but we do not recognize Facebook disorder. We do not recognize texting disorder. We do not recognize overuse of YouTube. So those are the things that we want to look at. We also know that limited research showed that for some folks who have self-described, I have a problem controlling my internet use, when we put them inside a brain scanner, the exact same part of the brain lights up that you would expect for someone who is taking cocaine and amphetamine. Well, we know this. But again, to what are people being drawn to? Think about your own lives with your own smartphones. What is it that draws you in? Is it novelty? Is it attention? Is it connection? Is it pleasure? It's all those things. These are the things that make an activity highly addictive. Number one, that activity has to be awesome. You have to really, really like it. Number two, it has to be accessible. Number three, having it anonymous. You can do it by yourself without anyone noticing. It has to be affordable. And it has to be what we call effective, takes away stress and burden. Cocaine, heroin, alcohol, gambling, eating, exercise, sex, all these things have the potential to be addictive. Is that true for digital devices and electronics? I think so as well. What do we need to know? And again, we talked a little bit about this. Again, is it the content on that the digital devices allow us to access, that's the addicting product, or is it the technology itself? In other words, should we then downgrade ourselves to only have 2 megabytes per second download speeds? Should smartphones have only allowed us to have 5 apps? Should Facebook and other social media companies be regulated just like tobacco and alcohol, such that they cannot put out devices and software that tickle our brains just like the way cocaine and alcohol does? Very, very interesting question. I want to wrap up with this very, very simple thing about what do we need to know, and why is it so important? Because as our relationship with digital technology evolves, we have to go back to this fundamental truth. is what is the impact on these digital devices on our mind, on our body, on our brains, and on our developments. We're going to hear a lot more about the developments, but when I tell you, when that patient of mine comes in and the mother describes a son that his sleep has diminished from 8 hours a night down to 4 hours a night, I know that is not healthy. I know that is a behavior that can be very, very toxic. The question is, has anyone died in America or throughout the world right now from a digital overdose? I don't know. That sounds completely far-fetched, but actually it has happened. We've had cases in Asia where people have died inside internet cafes connected to the internet by sheer exhaustion. So again, what is happening to what's going on here? The question's really, and I'll end with this proposed very simple roadmap, is this. We need much, much more information. We have a paucity, a tiny amount of information to understand what these devices do to our body, our brains, and our mind. This is the first time you'll hear this term, big tech. I just came up with it. Kind of like big tobacco, or big alcohol, and big food. Is Apple and Facebook and all these other folks, are they the enemy? No, absolutely not. But the partnerships with them, with folks like ourselves, and folks like you. Just this past week, leading up to today, there was a letter sent by the investors of Apple to Apple saying, we as investors are concerned that the product that we're investing in and creating is somehow harmful to young brains and minds. That's really fascinating to me. We really have to do more. And very simply, what I say in patients is this. I'm not trying to get you to stop using the internet or digital connections. But what instead I want to emphasize in treatment is you need to raise your level of integration and joy. The most number one predictor of happiness by the time that we reach our older life is social connections and social integration. That's it. That's the key to success. That's the key to happiness. So if digital devices allow us to become closer to each other and connect with one another, phenomenal. But also if it has the power to distract, to trigger those genetic vulnerabilities to addiction, that would be a concern. All right, so I'm going to stop there, and then I'm going to turn over to Dr. S. I can't pronounce that last name. And then we're going to go on with the rest of our position statements. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fong. Subramanian, Dr. Subramanian from Cal State LA. Go ahead, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, everybody. So I'm a developmental psychologist, and I've been studying interactive media and children and development for about 27 years, 28 years, for a long time. Since those early computer games on the Macintosh, the Apple Macintosh, you know, those computers, a long time. And my views about technology and development have evolved a bit as the technology has changed, as uses have changed. So I've sort of gone back and forth. So let me start with some observations about, and you know, much of my discussion does focus on children, adolescents, and emerging adults or young adults. So some thoughts about their use. So some things that are pretty striking is that majority of kids are online. They're using digital tools. Secondly, most of them are doing so at very young ages. And especially with the smartphones and the tablets, you're having babies and toddlers that are being exposed to educational apps. So it's younger and younger ages. And at least, you know, starting around adolescence, maybe a little before, most are also spending enormous amounts of time with these devices. So it is true to some extent that they may be always connected, never alone, right? And we think about them as digital natives, sort of like someone who's a native speaker of a language versus an immigrant. So someone like me might be more of a digital immigrant because I came to technology as an adult. But most young people today have lived virtually their entire lives using technology, enmeshed in technology, and they really have no conception of life without these tools. They have no idea of life without Google or Wikipedia. So my son is about 24. Oops, I was going to say 28, he'd kill me. But he's 24, and when he was in high school, so this is about 7, 8 years ago, he asked me, you know, Mom, a couple years ago, how did you guys go strange places, of new places that you hadn't gone before? I had to really think for a few minutes, right? Because, you know, we've been using GPSs for so long. And I told him, you know, there used to be this thing called the Thomas's Guide. Some of you remember it, right? That company went out of business, as did AIM. So anyway, you get a sense of this is truly a brave new world. And we at the Children's Digital Media Center at Los Angeles have for the last 25 years or so trying to be, have been looking at and seeing what kids are doing, how is this impacting development. And what is clear is that youth are mostly using it for communication, for information, for education, and entertainment. So they're living, they're learning, and they're communicating with these devices. Let me start briefly with communication, because those uses really dominate when it comes to young people. One of the things that has been clear from our research over the past 10 years is that at least for adolescents, much of their communication involves people from their offline lives. Certainly there are exceptions such as Twitter, but with messaging apps, they're not interacting with strangers. Much of their interaction centers around developmentally normative issues such as they're developing sexuality, formulating their identity, and becoming autonomous. Now, this use, although it is developmentally normative, it does have risks and opportunities. So just to give you one example with regard to identity, all these visual-based tools such as Instagram and Facebook really give youth nice opportunity to, kind of play around with their self-presentation. Now, what we don't necessarily know is whether this hinders or helps their identity development. Same thing with autonomy. Autonomy, becoming an autonomous individual, is a key developmental task for adolescents and young adults. And cell phones have really helped a little bit with that in terms of mobility, being able to get around and having, access to this technology. But on the other hand, I think it may also be hindering a little bit with autonomy. You have a fight with a peer, your first thought maybe is to call a friend or call a parent, rather than trying to solve it yourself or regulate your emotions on your own. So we don't fully understand that, but certainly what we know is there are risks and opportunities, and some individuals are more at risk for the dangers, and some individuals seem to benefit more from the opportunities. So for instance, individuals who seem to be high on social anxiety, multitasking seems to help them with managing their anxiety. On the flip side, kids who seem to have a lot of problems in their offline lives, they seem to be engaging in more risky behavior online, whether it's excessive use, such as, kind of along the lines of excessive video game play, whether it's talking to strangers. Some individuals who are already having problems such as truancy and substance use problems, they seem to be having more challenges online as well. With regard to learning, there's just, it has opened up a whole new world. As I said, when, every little thing, whether it's navigation, whether it's banking, whether it's going to restaurants, we really are doing things in a manner that we could never do before with our smartphones. But I do think we also have to pause and think about how it best might help us learn. And the evidence is a little unclear about that. Just to give you one example, everybody thinks that they're more efficient as a result of multitasking, but that's not necessarily the case. It does make you less efficient, and it does seem to disrupt learning when it's a new task. The last thing that I want to talk about is parents and their young children. I do think there's some studies, for instance, that shows that when parents are very caught up with their cell phone, children make more bids for attention. I think parents' use of the devices could interfere with that everyday conversation that is so important when children are very young. So at the end of the day, just to wrap up, this is a tool. Technology is a tool, and as with every other tool, you can use it to do great things, but if you don't use it properly in a way that fits in with your strengths, you may not do so many great things after all. Thank you.
Dr. Albright.
Great. Will this go right up? I guess it will. Yes. All right. Enough said, right? I'm going to pass it on now. Well, I've been looking at the internet since its early inception. I am a sociologist, but I also have 2 counseling degrees, so I kind of wear 2 hats when I think about this. And originally, I didn't really think about the internet, for example, as being addictive. A lot of people talked about that, and I kind of shied away from that because I thought to myself that, what's the difference between that and watching television? Early internet, you're looking at a screen, you're watching something, or you're, skimming through the web. So I didn't really see too much difference, and so I kind of scoffed a bit at this idea of it being addictive. But a couple things have changed my mind in recent years and have really changed the dynamics around interactive technologies. And the first of these is mobility. The fact that you've untethered from the wall and now this computer is in your hand and there's this always on, always available connectivity, that's a big difference. So in the last so many years, the fact that now you have these smartphones that are internet enabled, those are game changers in my view. The second thing is the idea of social media. This has built-in behavioral drivers that they're baking in to these programs to get you to come back, to get you to be addicted, to get you to repeat the behavior. So those two things combined, A, mobility, and B, the advent of social media, really drive this, if you want to say addictive or this sort of repetitive behavior. And when you look at it, in psychology, we talk about things that drive behaviors. And these are pretty well understood and well studied. This is the idea of Skinner, and it basically says that behaviors that are rewarded will be repeated in a sense. So you may or may not have seen this before, a pretty basic experiment. The idea that that little rat pushes a little lever and a pellet comes out of food. So you push the lever and you get the food. It's a reward, right? A reward system. So the thing is about this is if the rabbit, I keep saying that. If the rat pushes that bar and doesn't get anything, push it again, doesn't get anything, push it again, doesn't get anything, it's going to give up, right? There's no reinforcement to that behavior, so it stops pushing it. But if it pushes it all the time and always gets a reward, it kind of gets bored after a while. So that's, it's okay, but it doesn't necessarily just continue on. The most persuasive behavioral driver, if you will, the one that's going to keep things really going, is random reinforcement. That is, it pushes that lever, and sometimes a pellet comes, sometimes it doesn't. And that is the most addictive driving behavior in a sense, the one that will keep behaviors going. Well, if you look at this now, what does that remind you of? You talk about gambling. Here's Dr. Fong again. I'm going to pass it back that way. But this idea that, the one-arm bandit, you pulled it or you pushed a button in it, ring, 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 sometimes you win, sometimes you don't, right? That's what drives that behavior. It's random reinforcement. Sometimes you get it and all that cash comes down and lights flash and it's exciting, and sometimes you don't. Well, here's the thing. Social media is much like that as well. Scrolling is very much like that scrolling of the numbers or the cherries or the sevens on those one-arm bandits. In a sense, scrolling, because if you're on Instagram or Facebook, or Twitter, any of these, sometimes what you see, the news feed on Facebook, sometimes it's exciting, sometimes it's interesting, it's fascinating, it's delightful, sometimes it's boring, sometimes meh. So that's random reinforcement, built right in. Ding, I love it. Same thing with likes. You put up a photo, people like it, ding, that's a random reinforcer. Sometimes they don't like it, you put up another photo, So that's what's driving this sort of behavioral return to social media and mobility, is these built-in behavioral drivers. And they know what they're doing. And some of the early investors are actually starting to complain about that. Now, putting my sociology hat on again, this is becoming a global phenomenon. In parts of the world now, there are more cell phones than toilets. I'll let that sink in for a minute. So, which do you need more? The cell phone. So it's the idea that, now people are developing dependencies on these phones. And this is a new study that came up. Around the world, can you not do without the internet? And you can see in India, 82% of people said, no, I can't do without the internet. Young people studies by Cisco, they found that it's more important to young people to be connected than food, water, or air. So they see it as another aspect of living. And here's the thing. Some people like Dr. Fong and others might say, hey, take a break from technology, step away from it. But that, I would suggest or argue, is becoming increasingly difficult. Why? Because more and more of life is centering around that phone. It is becoming the command center, if you will, for what's called the Internet of Things. In other words, more and more things are controlled by your phone. For example, it becomes your house key with a smart house and it lets you in. It becomes your credit card. You're going to buy things with Apple Pay and such in the store. It becomes your job as you're a digital nomad. Maybe you're at Uber picking people up. things like that. It becomes your ride home, your transportation. Young people aren't even buying cars anymore because of car sharing, for example. It becomes your food. You're going to have it delivered to you. Restaurants are now downsizing or ramping up their deliveries because this has become so much more pervasive because of phones. And it becomes your socializing. So this is the idea. How do you step away from it when it's your car key, your house key, your means to food, work, and transportation? Thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion. Appreciate it.
Mary and Tina Gutsis from the USC School of Cinematic Arts, the folks that are giving us all this entertainment.
Yes, and despite how old you think I am, I'm very old school, so I have a position statement that I'm going to read. So what I would like to say is that children develop in environments of relationships. This means that they need stable relationships with adults, parents, caregivers, extended family, neighbors, community members, and healthcare providers. As children get older, they also need time with peers and time alone to exercise their social skills, but also to exercise their imagination in free and unscheduled time. Policies that prevent addiction are policies that foster opportunities for positive life experiences and policies that protect children against toxic stress, things like neglect and abuse. Positive life experiences become possible when you have things like supportive caregivers, family leave, high-quality daycare, well-trained teachers, language-rich environments, accessible parks and museums, neighborhoods and schools that are safe from violence and drugs, access to clean water and healthy nutrition, and access to quality health care. Media play and storytelling are very rich and emotion-affirming opportunities for pleasure, leisure, and social connectedness in the life of all people, from children to older adults. These are timeless and time-tested opportunities for serve and return interaction between adults and children. Playing with children is important. Play is not just for children. I just returned from Europe, where adults bring their children to coffee shops and restaurants, and children roam free, and everyone keeps an eye on them together. It's your job to play peekaboo with the child on the table next to you, so that they don't need a digital babysitter, or in the next seat of the plane next to you, to help provide that child a few seconds or minutes of interaction and a few seconds of relief from caretaking to their caregiver. It's your job because that child will grow up to be an adult, and they may be the adults that take care of you or your children one day. They may be your neighbor, your lawyer, your doctor, your nurse, accountant, or gardener. So regardless of what I've stated, we still need to be very thoughtful when choosing content for all media for children, just as we do with books and film. Is your child ready for a particular topic or theme? Are you ready to discuss it with them? These days, as games have diversified in their content, they actually contain excellent opportunities to have conversations about everything from perseverance to dating and even grief. Just like literature, games are an art form. It's there for us to transport and transform. And it would be very unwise to turn away our efforts from the true roots of addiction and focus only on chasing digital media as the next threat. Digital media is just cooking with information. We have to teach our children how to cook. That includes teaching them how to use a sharp knife, carry a boiling pot, and how to develop a wide and discerning palate. Because if children are consuming only one type of media, rest assured they're not getting everything they need. And if media is all they consume, they're getting too much of that and not other things they need from life. And lastly, children learn from adults. To ask them to not use media and screens when we're glued to them ourselves activates their sense of fairness, and children know when we are unfair and hypocritical. So there's no better fairness and truth rater than a child. Therefore, good behavior starts with adults. If we're not behaving well, why should our children behave well? So unfortunately, children at risk for addiction are growing up in environments of neglect or abuse where caregivers are unable to model and regulate behavior. I'm not really worried about well-adjusted children with available caregivers because it's actually incredibly hard to change behavior, and I do this for a living. So the reason why some children and adults are vulnerable to addiction is because their brain circuitry has already been wired for it. The brain has sensitive and critical periods for building brain architecture. The first 5 years, we build more connections than any other time in life. In adolescence, the brain prunes away connections that are not used very much and reinforces the ones that are used more. And this may come as a surprise to some, but the decision-making part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, develops well into a person's late 20s. We thus have many, many opportunities to grow and shape healthy adults. It gets harder as we get older, but we should be trying with all our might to focus on positive experiences. Those will include media, play, and storytelling. And of course, these experiences cannot be all that we engage in. There's plenty of analog to still learn about this earthly world that we all inhabit. Nature, museums, playgrounds, they must all be visited by children and adults because they serve a critical role in our development as human beings, in our physical and mental health, and in our resilience. So I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Since you were the last one to speak, let me start off with you. If you don't, Mariantina, I think it's Alan Alter, who's a professor at NYU, who wrote a book on this. And he delivers a story about how Steve Jobs, after introducing the iPad, talked about its importance and the fact it's this wonderful delivery system for information and entertainment. And then the New York Times interviewed him about a while later and said, so how do your kids like it? And he says, well, kids don't use it. My kids don't use it. I wouldn't have my kids use an iPad for several years. It's a little contrary to the dog food theory. There was a famous MBAs apparently learn about a guy who was a dog food company, goes to the board of directors or any group like this, and he ate his dog food in front of them to prove it was good dog food and a human could eat it. Well, if you have individuals who are manufacturing this, but they won't use it on their kids, but we don't necessarily hear that. I'm just wondering, at the School of Cinematic Arts in your group, is that a conversation you have with your peers over when you introduce electronic digital media to your children?
I think that's a concern for all of us, and content creators, designers are generally very attuned to the impact of the things they are creating. And I say generally, with my bias being that I'm an academic and I work at a research center that develops interventions that are designed to change behavior and improve human health and happiness. And so I have a very different mission than a lot of other people. But in general, content creators do feel a sense of responsibility because it is hard to have an impact. And when you do have an impact and you see that, you do feel ethically obliged to be responsible for what you're doing. So there's a lot more attunement, I think, with our younger students in terms of the impact of media that we create and the behaviors that we design. It's a big conversation among people in my department. So our department has been around for around 15 years. And half of the people in the department probably have become parents over the course, like everyone has grown into the department. And because they make a lot of this stuff, they're also tuned to it more. And so they moderate the use of it for their children. But again, we have to think about it as time displacement. We need a whole bunch of behaviors that are positive experiences to develop healthy. And if you're doing too much of one thing, then you're not doing a lot of other things you need to be doing. So same goes for TV watching or reading books or just spending too much time alone. Too much of anything is not a good thing for developing brains.
Right, but too much is what we're talking about here. The concept of stop measures, if you do have a newspaper, at what point you end up, you're through reading it and you put it aside. La La Land is ended, the movie's done. There's not a little thing saying another movie's going to start in 15 seconds. Instagram is forever. Facebook is forever. They're trying to get, as you're competing against, for somebody's attention, and you're competing against sleep.
We're not helpless human beings, though. And so what I would like to, always remind people is that you can also train self-regulation. And so you don't train self-regulation by just cutting people off from everything in life. In other words, even the American Academy of Pediatrics last year, they gave up on this concept of measuring screen time because screens are so pervasive that in the end, they have to focus on just teaching parents how to be good parents with the screens because that's the most important thing for them to focus on. how to regulate their own behavior because they're modeling it for their children, and how to be much more conscientious in those behavioral skills because, again, they're being passed on. And because the technology, it's not going to stop. It's going to be there. We, I think, do have to design certain things better with more responsibility, but it is a two-way street. We also have to keep teaching how to properly parent and how to also help parents be better parents, which is why I emphasize a lot of policy as being important for this.
Anybody else want to bite at that?
I'll just add that I think, that was that has been my perspective too in terms of the digital technology, the internet is just a vast arena, and it's a futile task to try and censor it, block it, unless if you go to China, and I don't know how they do it, but I was in China last week, and I would keep forgetting and go to Google, but obviously that wouldn't go anywhere. I'd have to go to Bing, which is not a good search engine. But anyway, in a way, I can train myself. But the point is that at the end of the day, it is going to be up to parents to do some of that teaching with their children, and you kind of have to start early. You do have to be consistent. You do have to follow through. A lot of parents will tell researchers they do X, Y, or Z, but you talk to children and they say their parents are not doing X, Y, or Z. So parents have to follow through, and you have to start early. A very simple example I like to give is with regard to phones. A lot of young people are constantly using their phone in the middle of the night and not getting good 7, 8 hours of sleep. And a very simple solution to that is to charge your phone outside your bedroom and use a real alarm clock. But in order to do that, you have to start real early when the children are 3, 4, 5, or whatever, when they are that they get their first device. So I think some responsibility does also, a large share of the responsibility is on the parents. And certainly I think technology, the companies can do better. I think Europe has a little more of that going on. But, we really do have to take responsibility, I think, in terms of how we use technology.
So Dr. Fong, it's just good parenting.
The term that we use is digital health, digital etiquette. And in America, we're so wonderful at creating panic and anxiety and fear.
That's my business.
That's your business.
Yeah. That's what I get paid to do.
And I love it. So, and I think one of the challenges is when you say to a parent or any person, shouldn't this just be common sense? Shouldn't I just know this? And the answer to that is no. It's that, again, we're talking about a lot of forces here that Mother Nature never really intended, even just 10 years ago. So limitless amount of human information, limitless interactions that are incredibly reflexive. These aren't, they tap our most primitive part of our brains that seek reward. So that's that concept of digital health. So I think about with our own kids at ages 12 and 8, I asked them, are you getting anything in school to talk about proper digital health and digital etiquette, which would include how to handle cyberbullying or how not to cyberbully? And so that's not happening yet. So we don't have those science-based curriculums that would be very effective to help prevent these things. But even for adults, when, my wife's not here so I can talk about this, is that when she's using the phone in the bathroom, is that proper digital etiquette?
You're being taped,
Oh! And she charges it by the nightstand, and we talk about it, and we talk about it in a family way, but she doesn't move it. This is what the challenge is for us as humans, to recognize this is not the enemy. The people who create content are not the enemy. The people who consume it are not the enemy. It's ourselves to recognize that we are humans and that we do get exposed to certain things that our bodies and our brains reflexively react to. But if we want to have healthier and more joyful lives, everything has to be moderation.
I think Google has a division of developmental ethics. And if you have a person in charge of developmental ethics, then it sort of implies there's a problem. And so I have it that it's parents, but there's an app, for example, called Guilty, from what I understand, Guilty. And what they do is that every day around noontime, they have this incredible deal on something. And so their research shows that people go to that app, and it's a really good deal on TV or whatever, but you have to buy it right away because you're in competition. It's a little like the slot machine that you were mentioning. And so now these people are sort of hooked on this because they don't always get it, like the rat, but they sometimes get it, and then they get in the habit of getting it so often, then they get into financial problems. We know that that some video games, like World of Warcraft, research shows that if you have the players kill somebody, they spend less time because they actually do it. But if they're supposed to save somebody, they take more time, and then you can string them along to the next game. So that's the reptilian part of your brain that they're going after. So I'm not sure we can let the Silicon Valley off the hook that easily on this kind of thing. So on another point, is there a gender difference here in who uses what? I mean, do girls, you know, this is stereotypic, but I'll throw it out there, girls more addicted perhaps to social media apps, and boys more addicted to video games?
I think the research in general did show always that boys played a lot more of games than girls. And yes, when it comes to addiction, I think at least with gaming, I think you find a lot more young males. I think Dr. Fong was referring to that as well earlier in our conversation. When it comes to social networking, certainly the data suggests that girls use it more than boys, and however, boys are using it more than they did in the early years. But in terms of addiction to social media, I'm not sure it's as well documented as, say, cyber sexing or gaming addiction. And there, it's again, in general, addiction that does seem to be a tendency for more males, young males.
I always think back of what Homo sapiens would do long before we had digital phones. And as a child, it would seem to me, you start to develop interpersonal relationships with an adult, and you read their face when you say something. We no longer do that because of texting. And there's a school of thought out there that says that's why the conversations online are so incredibly antagonistic. There's great antipathy. They will say something online that they would never say face to face. Is there something to that? Is Albright?
Yeah, I think there is something to that. I co-teach a class at USC, and we did a course for undergrads. And you know, over the so many years I've been teaching, I've noticed that there's a lack or a diminished spatial feedback from the students. Mm-hmm. You can tell, like they used to, you know, when you're talking, but now they're like, because the phone and emojis serve, I would argue, as prosthetic emotions. So you are actually in this environment smiling and laughing and out of control, and your face is, you know, so the point being is I teach this with a much older gentleman engineer, and afterwards the students came up and they said, oh, I love his stories, I love the history he's telling us, and he's a great storyteller. And I said, oh yeah, I love him too. And after he goes, I don't want to teach this again. I said, why not? He goes, they didn't like it, they didn't like me. I said, yes, they did. No, they don't. Because he didn't see the faces that he expected to see from back when. And so he said, I'm done teaching this class, because he's not getting the facial feedback and the response non-verbally from the students that he used to get years back when he taught undergraduate students. So it's marked and visible, and I would suggest that some of the research is showing they're not as good at reading non-verbal skills, which is a key to success in the workplace. So some of the workplaces are going to have to deal with that in terms of maybe teaching some of these soft skills, or maybe in college or high school. Reading people is a very important skill for success.
Expressing emotion too, which is an issue, yes.
Yeah, I noticed everybody over 30 was nodding, and everybody under 30 was. You know, I don't know if you've got this problem at SC or at UCLA, but I know at UC Davis, for example, they have a problem with the enrollment of females versus males. It's an issue on college campuses. It's not a big deal in terms of a national dialogue, but they're starting to see it. UC Davis veterinarian school is like 70% female. North Carolina, 65-35 female. There's a school of thought that males, that video games have an influence on the fact that boys are graduating from college at lower levels, vastly lower levels than females. They're not doing as well in graduate schools. Is there, you know, is this a reach here, or or have you heard, is that part of the conversation, that there are so many boys now who are completely fixed at video games that other aspects of their life, including the development of academic skills, are being hurt by this?
You want me to field that?
I-
Enrollment with regard to gender varies tremendously depending on the discipline, tremendously. And I think that I have read some of these research studies that perhaps you're referring to, which are primarily about white males and of a particular socioeconomic background who don't perhaps find opportunities, or they lack other skills to sort of make it in life. And they tend to suffer from depression and other issues. And so we have to think about what is contributing to the depression of those young people who don't perhaps see that there's a point to getting out of their parents' basement or their room for them to go to college, and what are the social emotional skills they lack in terms of desire, motivation, and perseverance, because those are skills that are really required for you to leave your house and survive college and life in general. So depending on their socioeconomic background, the reasons are different. I don't think they're a giant demographic, but they're certainly an emerging demographic. And
But there's a gender, do you agree there's a gender difference?
in terms of, leaving white males behind.
We're looking at the numbers.
'Cause that was
Just
how
the
that was
numbers. I'm looking
framed.
at the numbers at the University of California, at the University of North Carolina. If you talk to academics,
Yes.
my son is out of college, but when he was going, I had a dean call me up, said, "Can he come to our school?" Why? Well, he's male, isn't he? We need men. Says, it was a Catholic school. Is he Catholic? He's Catholic. We need Catholics too.
Yeah, I mean, I think
It depends by discipline.
no. Well, there are,
But that's a little bit of a cop-out, because yes,
Not
it is
really.
depends on discipline, but Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, when I was there, my father was a professor, 80-20 male. Now it's 52-48 male.
I
But
would-
women didn't used to leave the house to go to college.
I got that. I'm just, so it's a very good point, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be there. I'm just saying that the predominant male institutions, engineering, architecture, now have a very large female influence.
I would actually, I would agree with you partially. So it is true that if you look at the total number of college-going students, there are many more females than males. That is absolutely true in terms of the applications, especially if you look at all the top institutions. It's definitely true, but it's also true that there are differences by discipline. So for instance, engineering and others still are largely female, and in my discipline, psychology, I'm lucky if I have 2 males in my classes. And in my GE classes, which have a lot more males, I may have about 10%, 15%. So I would agree that there's a gender difference, but I honestly wouldn't lay it on video games. I know that boys are definitely more at risk for video games. I think there are a lot of things that have happened in the last 50 years that have contributed to it. I would even just hazard one thing, for instance, is that, and I'm just purely speculating here. I'm not saying that this is the reason, but I'm just giving you one example of a difference, is that our elementary schools, if you look at it, the teachers are largely female. And some people have hypothesized that perhaps, when you only have female teachers and, boys are mostly seeing female teachers at home, in school, then maybe what they're exposed to doesn't necessarily tap into their interest. I would also argue that the current, where you have boys to be, students sitting in desks and for protracted amounts of time may not necessarily fit in with how boys learn. And so there might be a mismatch between what boys bring to the table and what schools expect of them. And then, of course, you have large number of girls and boys who are growing up in homes without a father present. So I think there have been a lot of sociological, demographic changes happening that probably contributes to this trend. I wouldn't lay it all on video games, I think.
One of the essential questions really, again, is does early exposure to these digital devices fundamentally change brain functioning, shorten the ability of people to learn, to listen, to attend, to emote, to become who we are in 2018? We have no scientific proof on any of that as of yet, and that's where we need. Again, the NIH, which funds all scientific research, or the majority of health research in America, and their budgets are $30 billion a year, they have one study right now that's looking at internet gaming disorder. And so there's other things, like they don't like to study normative growth and development, things like Dr. Subramanian does. So it's a real struggle. So the discussion point whenever I do these pieces is this: we need more data, we need more multidisciplinary looks at this, and we need more partnerships. The irony of all ironies is that all these software companies and these digital devices are sitting on massive amounts of data. Who uses it, when they use it, how they use it, what time of day, what works, what doesn't work. This isn't like selling crack cocaine. It's not like a dealer keeps databases on how much crack they're selling down at the corner. It's very different. So we have an amazing opportunity to really dive through this, but we don't have the resources. We have a lot of intellectual minds, we have a lot of people who are passionate, but we haven't yet identified it very simply. Is this a public health crisis? The opiate epidemic is a crisis. The influenza epidemic is a crisis, but have we identified overuse or unhealthy digital relationship as a public health menace yet? And I don't think we're there yet, and I don't think we are going to get there unless there are huge sentinel events. But there's more than enough of a signal that we really should be concerned, and we really should be getting our ducks in a row, as they say now, rather than 10 years down the road.
We're going to open it up for questions because you have some, but just one more from me. The head of IKEA says that we've reached a peak of where people accumulate stuff, and actually it was a couple of years ago, and now it's people want to do stuff. That's what and it's driven by social media because you don't post stuff you buy, you post stuff you do. That seems like a positive aspect, but there, from what I understand, there's research to show that in and of itself can be debilitating to some on, say, a social media platform, Facebook, because you're constantly seeing your friends do all sorts of great things, and your life doesn't measure up. Because they're smiling, they're happy, they're at Yosemite or whatever, and I'm just here in my basement with my folks. Is there research to show that?
Yeah, well, that's what my book's about, actually. I call that being untethered. And there's a lot of research out there that shows that younger people in particular are coming untethered from traditional social structures, like getting married, buying a house, buying a car, having kids, all these sorts of things that were very normative for generations prior, they're not doing anymore. Buying cars, all these things. And not going to church. All these things are down if you look at the numbers. And, IKEA, it's interesting. They're responding specifically to this hyper-digitalization by creating furniture that will charge when you put the phone down on the sideboard or something like that, it charges it, stuff like that. So they're trying to react to this, the digerati, if you will. But that's what I'm actually looking at in this book, and looking at tying all the studies together. And the second piece that you talked about, where you're comparing your life, I call that the virtual mirror. We have always looked to the reflected appraisals of others for our self-identity construction. Mom and smiling at us, or whoever these caretakers are, and we internalize that. We're bad or we're good based on these people around us. But now that reflection comes from here. And as you noted, quite importantly, I think, the people put very highly curated lives online. They're fabulous. Everything is amazing. And, it's easy. They curate out some of the sad times, the down times, the darker times. So, my point on that is children or kids, teens, they don't necessarily have the coping skills in life to get through some of these things, and they're looking at these other people, and their lives are over the top all the time. Well, my life's not over the top. I don't always look fabulous, and it's driving a lot of insecurity, it's driving anxiety, and it's driving depression, particularly amongst younger people.
Did you want to
And
add?
without the stabilizing social forces in place, you see, because those have come unraveled.
Yeah, definitely. I think social comparison is there, and I think that's a documented social psychology phenomena, and I think that definitely happens with self-presentation. And like I said before, I think it definitely helps young people in terms of being able to present different aspects of their self, explore their identities in ways that maybe they couldn't do before. But I think the flip is if you're engaged so much in this sort of false self-exploration, what does it do to your real self? And of course, you know, one thing you do notice in Facebook is that it's always a few people who are doing all of this showing off, if you will, and the vast majority of us are lurkers. We're just watching what everybody else is doing. So there's a little bit of that as well. And you know, I think again, though, what we have found in our research is that some individuals are more at risk. For instance, in a victimization study that we did with cyberbullying, what we found was that the kids who were already depressed at time one were much more susceptible in terms of the victimization. And if they had offline support, then it moderated that, you know, it helped them deal with the victimization a little bit. So we do have this theory which is called rich get richer and poor get poorer. So some individuals seem to benefit more from online explorations, and other people who seem to already be lacking in social resources seem to be hurt.
Well, I was going to take a selfie just before she said that, so I was upset with all of us. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much.
Yes, we
You
hear
can
you.
hear me anyway. Okay, thank you so much for sharing with us today. My question is about education and instructors, teachers, professors. How do they compete with their students who are potentially addicted to their phones, right? Like the teacher is so boring compared to, oh my gosh, I got to check my phone all the time, right? So what is the future of this? What do you see, and what can instructors and teachers do to stay interesting, I guess,
Are
as
you
this
a teacher?
generation continues? No, I'm not. My partner is, though, so I'm asking this question on behalf of her.
Well, have them turn off the devices. You know, some people, I know some instructors, many of my colleagues are increasingly having people shut their laptops or put away their phones, because you are competing with these devices. In our own research in the lab, what we have found is this sort of multitasking does interfere with new learning. But I don't know, have you cracked the code here?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I was thinking back to that Stephen Jobs comment earlier, the idea that, you know, he didn't let his kids use the iPads. And very ironically, and I think you'll get this right away, the schools that the kids who are the children of the tech scions in Silicon Valley, that are very elite private schools up there, they don't have devices in those schools at all. What are they doing? They're doing physical things. They're doing art. They're doing bodily movement, dance. They're doing drawing and painting and the things that will create a different kinds of, you know, they talk about brain neuroplasticity. This is his job, but, you know, the idea that you're changing your neural pathways by the things that you're inputting. So, I mean, take that as instructive, I would say. If you're the top tech guys in the world, and your kids are going to private schools where they intentionally do not have technology, what is that telling you?
It's the Waldorf School of the
Yes,
Peninsula,
yes.
right? Yeah, exactly. And remember, the superintendent of LAUSD, of the previous superintendent, wanted to put an iPad in everybody's hand, every 700,000 of the students in the school. Yeah. He made the argument that it's technology, but, you know.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Well, hopefully that's the future, but it seems, and this is what's confusing to me, that we are all dependent on technology, not addicted, but dependent. We don't need nicotine, we don't need cocaine, but we need technology. And perhaps, like with peanut exposure, maybe giving kids exposure early on is protective in some way, that all disease is a function of vulnerability and exposure, and maybe some sort of mechanism early on will improve children's ability to manage technology without becoming addicted, if you will.
That's an interesting question.
I think that using things with your children in general, because you're modeling and you're helping make sense of the behavior with them, is generally what most people recommend. That's what the American Academy of Pediatrics is now moving toward in terms of teaching parents. And again, like everything else, children look to us to help make sense of the world. If we're not available to do that for them, they're going to come to their own conclusions, and they may not be the ones that, you know, are best for them. So you have a very good point.
And I would
That's a
also
good
say that a lot of parents are using these devices as digital babysitters. And if you go on Google right now and Google baby with iPad, you will come up with literally tens of thousands of results. And what you'll see there is that there are, infants, babies with iPads that have digital skills that are better than a lot of older Americans, and yet they don't have the ability to speak yet. They can pinch, turn on things, play things. It's unbelievable. So, we don't even know what the impact of that
Yeah,
is going to be.
part of
but-
that is because parents also lack the patience or time for many reasons, depending again on their availability, because maybe they work 2 jobs, maybe they lack themselves the self-regulation skills, and so it is, humans are incredibly lazy, and so the path of least resistance will be followed if it's available. And it takes a lot of effort for you to regulate your child and say no. It takes a lot of time for you to be available and sit down and teach them stuff. And so again, I have to take it back to what are we doing in general at large as a society that is making parents less able to do the things they need to do. Because it's not just the availability of technology, it's the unavailability of the parents physically and emotionally to just be there to do the things they need to do. We have to look at the problem from both sides.
Yes, sir.
Yes, good morning. I'm an educator, high school. I work at a continuation high school. Kids come for various reasons. And in my classroom, we have circles. I don't have desks, straight rows. Every day we sit down for 15 minutes and we talk. And what I have come to find out and realize is that why should they keep quiet? They don't know what to do with the quiet.
Let's say that
Sorry,
again.
say that again.
Okay?
We like
And that last part.
Yes, sir. They don't know what to do with the quiet.
Oh,
when
they
quiet.
Yes,
How
quiet.
interesting. Yes.
Because we have a minute of silence, 2 minutes of silence. And it's very hard for them to turn their phones on. I ask them to turn them off. If they don't, it's okay. Because they have to do it for their reasons. And their reasons have not been given strategies for being quiet. They don't know what to do when they close their eyes. So I teach meditation.
Well, if I could ask you, is that because you don't believe they've been taught that, or they are so overly
Oh,
stimulated?
no, they haven't been taught. That's the reality of our society. For example, we recently went to a WASC accreditation. We had 3 principals come to our school for 4 days. One of the persons just finished his PhD here at USC. I won't tell you what school because it might say so. But so I'm saying to him, what'd you get your thesis? What was your thesis about? He said it was about mindfulness.
About what?
Mindfulness.
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 Being still, social emotional. In my class, I call it social emotional mindfulness. And he said, I did my research on mindfulness, so I went to my professors and asked them their opinion about mindfulness. He said he got no help at all. He said one professor later came up to him afterwards and says, I didn't come forth because I didn't want my fellow professors to know that I didn't know what mindfulness was. Now, this was in a school at a PhD level. I don't want to say anymore as to what school it was. And he was totally flabbergasted. What's the word? Is that right? You got it. Okay, I got that right.
How about your students? What's the response you get from them?
Oh, man. I had a student yesterday who had to leave early. I said, why are you leaving, man? He says, well, I'm following what you told me to do. I said, what's that? He says, you told me I need to have quiet time with myself. He says, Mr. Fulton, I'm going home and have quiet time with myself because my mother, who was stressed on the job, quit. So he's working at a liquor store. So she came to me and my brother and told us straight out, you got to give me $200 a month on rent. So I said, what are you going home to do? He said, I'm going home to get quiet. I said, oh, you are? He said, yeah. He said, because I need to talk to her about the way she handled it. I said, you are? Huh? I said, so.
No wonder he's getting quiet. Yeah.
Well, all my kids, regardless of what their situation is, They really are good kids. They just don't know how to be quiet and be silent and let the spirit within them nudge them on how to handle their business. Okay, it's mindlessness, and mindlessness is absurdity, and absurdity is doing the inappropriate things. That's all this is. This is I've been doing this for 45 years, so my research has shown this. So I said to him, I said, well, let me share this with you, little brother. I said, the first thing you want to do is remember that's your mother. Never, ever, ever disrespect your mother, because she's probably doing something and she's not something's going on in her life that she doesn't want you to know about. I said, so what's important is that when you do this from a position of feeling a sense of peace, love, and harmony in your heart. And you be still and quiet and know the truth. But you don't do it if you're going to be argumentative with her. I said, that's a requirement. I hold you to that. I said, so here's the strategy. I said, once you get quiet and still, you go to your mother, you say, first, you explain to her what she did. What she said and what she did. That's all. Then you tell her, I feel hurt. I feel this. I feel that. And the moment you start to feel angry and mad, you cut off the conversation, you go away. You don't discuss with her anything as long as you're in fear, worry, anxiety, frustration, depression, and anger. You don't do that when you're mad, because it's not going to come out right, and she doesn't deserve that. She deserves you to be the right person that you are. I said, do you understand me? He said, yes, sir. I said, now, then the third thing you do after you say, one, this is what happened, to only two things in life to get us in trouble, what we say and what we do. Once you say, tell her what she said as much as you can, quote, even write it down. What she did that you didn't like, that you felt hurt about. Tell her how you feel, I feel. And then the third thing you say to her, now, Mom, in the future, if you have something to say, pull me aside and let me know what's going on.
And there's no app for that. Thank you very much. A round of applause for this gentleman who is a teacher. Go ahead.
My children are very nervous that I'm here. I have an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old, and we do try very hard to find the balance and moderate their intake, their screen time. I have two questions. One, do you think that the autonomy versus sort of collective experience, on the one hand, I want my child to go and do what she wants to do, but then when I see that it's just watching somebody on YouTube open packages endlessly, you know, I need to end that. And so then it becomes, okay, you can watch something if it's a narrative, you know, and then it becomes, I think, well, I have to take it a step further. And is watching something with your child a shared experience?
Yes, it is, but also, as the gentleman right before you discussed, tolerating nothingness is one thing that you also have to model. So most parents like you, when they ask me a lot of that question, they have anxiety about moderating things that are available because there is so much content available. And what their children don't have, and you know, your children become my students. I get them basically 17 to 30 age and have to work with what has been given. And what has been given to me is children who have been overscheduled, because I teach at USC. I used to teach community college, and I had very different children with different problems, but at least at USC, what I get is parents who are so worried about doing the right thing for their kids, they're missing some things. And so I think that unscheduled free time, working with the imagination, having them tolerate nothingness, a lot of those kinds of things that help their autonomy and also just inner peace are going to be very valuable for them long term. So it's not so much managing all that's available and making sure they're always consuming something. They need a, you know, abstinence from
Absolutely.
things. And that means we have to abstain too and teach them how to do that.
And it's very hard to
Very hard.
always take the deep disappointment when I say no.
Yeah,
know,
well,
No,
Yeah.
you may not. You can read, you can play with your Lego, you can blah, 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 blah.
being sensitive has its downsides, doesn't
Yeah.
it?
Right.
Well, watching is important, but I think equally important is discussing and using
Yes.
that as an opportunity for conversation.
Yeah.
I think media, as much of a bad rap as it gets, it can really also fuel good conversations.
Yeah.
Again, with with my adult son now, sometimes, I remember when he was at home, we would talk sports, and that was what interested him. So that was our opportunity to interact. So I think that's another way of maybe getting something more out of this experience.
On the positive side.
On the positive side.
And then quickly, when the government gets back up and running, do this minuscule amount of research, how do we amend that? Is that incumbent on the academic community to push to have more research done in these public health areas? Or is there citizenry that gets involved? How
Everything.
does that help?
Everything
Everything.
helps.
Everything helps. So calling your congressman, writing letters, media pieces, open discussions like this. The hope here is that you guys would take this information and have discussions in your own local neighborhoods with your other parents. Create your own journals, write, do your own video log, whatever. I mean, that's the only way that things get changed. When we think about how HIV/AIDS, it was the lobby of a very powerful voice, but it was also really tragic deaths that drew national attention and media coverage. Once we had that, and then it was drawn, then we had the power of science to kind of combat this. This is a little much more subtle. This is very, very subtle. It's not an easy target. Again, as to your comments, again, there's this always, what should I do? There's this culture we've created of perfection for everything, for being a kid and for being a parent. We had to battle against that. The fascinating question in your story there is, what is it about opening packages that's compelling to your child? So she may not know why. I know that when I was a kid and when I watched WWF, my father said, what is compelling to you about seeing Hulk Hogan? I couldn't describe it. He's like, you're an intelligent son, you're really good in school, you have lots of friends, but you watch garbage. But I was compelled to watch it in 1985, 87. It was so, I couldn't explain it. So she may not be able to explain it. So again, I think the roadmap I want a lot of folks to leave here with is that what I really emphasize in the office is passion, joy, social integration, social connection, and where I think not only where kids are missing autonomy, what they're missing is they're missing mentors, they're missing opportunities, they're missing the belief that they're not perfect, and to be able to tolerate that you're not going to be the best at what you do. There are other people smarter, faster, and bigger and stronger than you. But who you are, you have to celebrate that. You have to celebrate your imperfections. I never learned mindfulness as a child, but I learned how to cope with stress. I learned how to cope with anxiety. And I learned how to cope with doubt. And that came because I had a lot of mentors. I had a lot of peers that were really good to me. And I had a lot of just really fun experiences. But if I were to grow up in this world nowadays, who knows? And so this is a different world that we've created. This is a different society than it was even just 10 years ago. But we really have to not, instead of everything, be afraid of it, embrace it, and tell people who can make a difference. And that's the key, by writing to your legislator, to your congressman, and even writing to like big tech, writing to Apple. Say, I saw that letter from your investor. I, as a mother, want to be informed. I want to be involved. Invite me up to Apple headquarters. I want to tour it. Thank you.
And those investors, by the way, is California Teacher Retirement System, CalSTRS, which is, which is saber rattling with Apple over iPhone addiction. Go ahead.
I just have to say, parenting is a really hard job. Really, really, really hard. And especially if you're the parent of a child who's busy and moves around all the time and never stops. And I have one daughter, she's 25 now, and she was probably that year, 1992, where she was the pure digital native. And so, but even back then in those days, I read in the LA Times an article, somebody knew this, where they said, don't let your child have a television or a computer in their room. Keep it in the family room, keep it at the dining room table, the family computer, whatever, so that you're always sort of around and you sit down and you watch TV with your kids. Well, I was really firm about the television, but I went out of town to visit my parents in Florida. I was gone for a week. My daughter was 5. I came back and there was a computer in her room. bought by my husband. So we got the TV and we kept it out of the room, but we did do the whole watching thing, you know, even One Tree Hill and Mean Girls and all those horrible shows that they used to watch. So you have to sort of do that, and then you have an opportunity to say, you know, did you like what she said? You know, that's
It's definitely hard work. And it's harder, as you pointed out, that it's no longer just a TV. This
Yeah.
travels in your pocket now. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. So just kind of touching on the importance of the parental role, I like what was mentioned earlier about it takes a village, sort of that sort of mentality. I think that might work a little better in Europe in some places than it might here for various reasons. But I'm a single mom. I'm not going to talk about my kids' specific issues with their digital devices because they're in the back and they'd probably hate me forever if I did. But being a single parent, being a parent is hard. Being a single parent is nearly impossible. I have a 2 to 2.5 hour commute 6 days a week, work full time, volunteer, and I am a student. And so sometimes those devices, yeah, it works when I get home and I'm exhausted.
Exactly.
But I do have a concern because I do see how it can be, in my opinion, an absolute addiction. But with that and knowing my situation, I would like to know how you feel about maybe the education system, the schools getting more involved, maybe taking some more responsibility or accountability for assisting with teaching children, excuse me, how to properly use their digital devices so that it doesn't become, an addiction, especially in cases that are similar to mine. I know my situation is not unique.
Did your school use digital devices?
They do. They have computers. I'm not sure if they have iPads. I'm not sure if they have iPads, but they
so is
for
your
sure
child
do.
introduced in school to digital?
Yes. So
More at school than at home?
It might be about the same, about 50-50. At school, they work on coding. They do, other programs that can help in future
Right.
careers, within that sort of digital community. And that's wonderful, but they also have time to just play games on the computer.
Got it.
And so where's the discussion of, okay, moderation, this is what it should be used for?
Is there?
Well, I think, he called it digital health. I call it digital literacy. I think digital literacy skills are very important. I don't think consistently, unless you have very, I think part of the challenge is that the teachers in schools themselves they're themselves learning these digital literacy skills. It is my hope that eventually schools will be more proactive about teaching digital literacy skills, but absolutely, just as, the professionals do the teaching of math and English, I would hope that this becomes something that is part of the curriculum. It's not yet, but I think it should be.
Great, thank you.
We're running out of time. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, just something quick. One of the things that I observed basically is how things have shifted from I was in college when the cell phones were introduced, and then I saw a whole bunch of changes. And one of the things that I find the most is people that grew up with cell phones practically in their hands, all that stuff, is a lack of empathy. And that's one of the big telltale signs is just like it, because how can you learn empathy from a device in your hand? You don't learn, you don't have eye contact, you don't hear that stuff that everyone was talking about here today, that about basic human contact. You can't learn compassion. You can't learn mindfulness because all the bells and whistles are going off about, oh wow, let me go see, oh Johnny, look what's going on over here. And with this overstimulation of the brain that simulates connection, it simulates connection, but it is not actually connection. How many times have people gotten still with a person that they care about, looked into their eyes, and had a meaningful conversation?
Right.
And had something that, and just something, I'm just wrap this up real quick. And even getting addicted to someone else's phone. I had a conversation one time. My cell phone was on the table, and we were at a restaurant. My cell phone starts to buzz. Her face started to twitch. Aren't you going to get that? I mean, come on. Most important person is across from me. Anyway, I'll leave it with that.
Right, yeah. Julie, did your book deal with that?
Well, I was just thinking, there's so much in that, to say. There's so much in that to say, but there is research out there that says that if these phones are on the table at that dining, experience, that you're paying less attention to the person that you're with. So the idea of just, them completely being off the table, completely out of sight. Otherwise, it's, should I check it? Should I check, and then there you are, off and running.
One of my colleagues at the UCLA Digital Media Center, and she's here in the audience, Dr. Yules, they did a study, she's raising her hand there. They did a study where kids in a summer camp, in a nature camp, right? They didn't have access to their devices, and what they found was definitely an improvement in their ability to read emotions a week without these devices. So I think that's just really, I think, speaks to a lot of what all of you are saying. Did I say that right, Yalta? Okay, good.
I had read one study where they tested students with the phone that they could use their phone and take messages, and then the same test to another group where they had the phone in the next room, and then a third group where the phone was off but it was on their desk, and the group that scored the most was the phone without the students without the phone in the room. And that the students, they thought they would improve dramatically if the phone was turned off, but it was still in their presence. It didn't.
It didn't.
It was still just the fact that it was there. It wasn't even on. Last question, ma'am.
Okay. I came all the way from Temecula today because because this subject is near and dear to my heart. I have a 17-year-old daughter who was fully addicted to the digital. She had 2 computers in her room, a TV, and she would never go anywhere without her cell phone. She called that her coping device. She was full-on addicted. This is an epidemic, and we as parents, we're doing our job. We are not doing our job in taking care of our children and making sure that they have one-on-one time or family time or group time. And I want to know, as a parent who has a child in a residential treatment center where she's not allowed to go near anything digital, they will not allow her, that is my stipulation. What can I do so that when she does come home, I want to throw all her computers out, but what can I do as a parent to prepare myself for that day?
Well, those are some good, I know she'll have something to say, just 2 quick things. One, just bouncing off some of the things we've heard here earlier, that quiet time. So one of the other things that's suffering is the family dinner. And people
Big time.
So the idea of maybe setting up a rule about, hey, no devices at dinner, you and I will talk, and having that be that device-free moment for the family. Second thing that's also suffering is time out in nature, which is, again, that quietude, which is relaxing. So maybe, that you guys can take some time, go Huntington Garden and walk out somewhere and have those times where those devices are out. That's a spiritual moment and a sort of a replenishing moment, and something that you can do together to create memories.
Very simply, number one, you need to take care of yourself. You need to put your oxygen mask on first. So that means
I haven't
for
done it
you,
yet.
well, exactly. So for you, that means getting your own therapist, your own support, focusing on your own sleep, your own activities. That's number one.
What kind of support are you referring? I mean,
Well,
I'm
there's
like,
not a lot of support groups, but that may mean you may certainly want to start your own, because there's certainly plenty of people who are out there for you. Number two, in the case of your daughter, this is what we see a lot, is that oftentimes the expression of the, quote, addiction from digital stuff is basically untreated depression or untreated ADHD or untreated bipolar disorder or something else. So unfortunately, that's one of the things in young people we see, is that it may be getting a better mental health treatment plan. So once you treat that underlying condition, then the digital, quote, addiction fades away. But for you, ma'am, and thank you for sharing in a public forum like this, you'll find that there are a lot of folks out there like yourself, and when you have the power of fellowship, that helps. But until you take care of yourself first, that's going to be very difficult for you to manage at home life.
But how does she reintroduce her daughter into the world of digital after this?
That's a good question.
I think you may, we have some data, for instance, that says that, the cues do trigger the craving. So I think you may have to, I don't know how you do it without flipping out maybe in terms of getting those devices out of her reach in the bedroom or putting it in a common space. But I think also your own use of your phones, like I said, I think in terms like charging the phone, you got to put it in a place that's separate where you do the same thing, but really try and I don't know how you sanitize it, but sort of the same way you keep the alcohol locked up in a cabinet. Maybe a little bit, because those cues can trigger the desire to go work. I mean, that's a very basic level.
And this is the unique aspect of addiction treatment. So
Right.
if you were to come into our office, this is what we would tell you very simply. Don't focus on worrying about where the devices are. Focus on her activities, what she does, where her mental health state is. So oftentimes with our folks who are struggling with drug or alcohol addiction, I don't urine drug test them. I'm not interested. I assume they're using. Instead, I want to know who they're spending time with, what are they doing, how are they improving their lives. And when they're doing those things, it almost doesn't matter whether they're using or not. What matters is, are they improving their quality of life? Are they reducing suffering and enjoying their lives more? So that's the short
We
answer
did
there.
find out she has reactive attachment disorder.
So, which is a very complex psychological condition, which
Yes.
makes sense then why an attachment to a device that's instant, that's 24 hours a day, is soothing, and in some ways self-medicating.
Here. Thank you very much for coming. Enjoy your day.